want to start with the audience. Again, you want to analyze the audience. You want to brainstorm, and you need to do it in a structured way for you to identify your key messages. You want to be able to support your key messages with the right mix of logic, facts and figures, and emotion, storytelling, analogies, metaphors. You also want to be able to create a clear storyline from the very beginning, where you want to be able to grab the audience's attention to the very end with a powerful conclusion. So there are practical ways to do that. Then you have the illustration side of things.
You're listening to the Sales Today podcast, and I'm your host, Fred Copestake. On this podcast, we explore how sales professionals can develop a modern approach to winning business, the application of virtual selling techniques, how to create meaningful business relationships, and much more. Why not take our free collaborative selling scorecard to see how your sales approach suits today's environment? You'll find a link in the show notes. And welcome to this episode of the Sales Today podcast, where I'm delighted to be joined by Andrea Pacini. He is the author of Confident Presenter. And I think it's really important that he's on this episode because presentation is an important part of selling. I think sometimes I've not really concentrated on that enough. So, Andrea, welcome.
Thank you. Thank you, Fred. Thanks for having me.
No, I'm really looking forward to some of the stuff you're going to say because I've read the book and it aligns so much with what I think and what I train. So of course it's got to be right then.
If you say so, yeah.
No, but of course you go deeper than I do because of the limited time on the training that we have normally. But should we just step back a little bit and just talk about what are the three biggest challenges or the challenges that you tend to see when people are presenting?
Sure. So let's go like one at a time. The first one and the main challenge is that often we know so much about a subject. I'm thinking about also salespeople, about a product, a service, and we know so much about it, and we are so close to it that we think that what we are communicating is simple and clear for the audience to understand. Often the experience from the audience's perspective is the opposite. I'll give an example. So this is something that I borrowed from a great book from many years ago, Made to Stick by the Heath brothers. Fantastic book. And in that book, they talk about what they think, and I agree with them, the number one the number one obstacle in communication, which they call the curse of knowledge. And they mention an example where in 1990, a psychology student asked two groups of people to play a game, tappers versus listeners. I don't know, Fred, whether you've heard of that game, but basically you've got these two groups. The tappers, what they have to do is they have to think about famous songs. So think about very famous songs like, I don't know, Happy Birthday to You, songs like that. And then instead of singing the songs, they had to tap them out on the table, just the rhythm. Okay. And then the listeners, they had to try and guess the songs. That's it. Now, before the experiment started, the student asked the tappers to estimate how many songs they thought that the listeners would have guessed. And they estimated 50% of the songs. Now, in reality, things were very different because the listeners only guessed 2.5% of the songs. It was 3 songs out of 120. So massive difference. Why? Because if you are a tapper, you have knowledge that the listener doesn't have. If you're a tapper, you have the songs in your head. And so for you, as you tap them out, the songs are obvious. But if you are a listener, you don't have that knowledge. You don't have the songs in your head. And so for you, it's not obvious at all. And this is the number one problem in communication, the curse of knowledge. Once we know something, it could be our idea, a concept, a product, or service, we find it hard to imagine what it means not knowing it. The curse of knowledge is our inability to imagine what it means not knowing what we know. And if you think about it, Fred, we say all the time, we say between presenters and the audiences, between writers and readers. You wrote two books, so it's something that I'm sure you considered in the process. You see it between politicians and voters. You definitely see it between salespeople and buyers, and it's very hard to fall to fall. It's very easy to fall into this trap unless you find a way to get access to some sort of an external perspective. So this is the main challenge I see, the curse of knowledge. I'm happy to go through a couple of others, but I'll just leave it with you for now because I don't want to speak too much.
No, no, that's what you're here for. It's your job. I'm happy for you to speak. Um, no, that makes a lot of sense. When I first think about curse of knowledge, I sometimes think about that it's, well, I've got a lot and I want to give you a lot. And so people say too much. But it's interesting what you're explaining there, which is, well, yes, everybody knows this stuff. So let's go straight into the advanced, the spangly stuff. And it's, whoa, you've lost me before you've started because you've gone off up into the clouds when really the assumption you made was too much. I need the basic to get a grasp of what we're talking about. And then maybe we go a little bit more advanced.
And Fred, yes, and it very much depends on who is the audience. So
Yeah.
it depends on the audience, the context, and that takes me to the second problem that I see, which is that we may have a message which is simple for the audience to understand. It may be clear for them to follow. That's great, but often it's not relevant to them. It's not relevant to the audience. And and I'll give you another example. Now, some time ago, we worked with a client. Her name is Marie from Paris. Marie is an executive. She's an expert in leadership. And she was invited by an association in Finland to give a talk about leadership. And she was super excited. It was one of her first international speaking opportunities. And so she prepared really well. She knew her message. She told us that she had prepared 50 beautiful slides. And also, she practiced properly. So she was ready to go. She flew to Finland the day before the conference, then arrived there on the day half an hour before the audience because she wanted to make sure that she had time to set things up. And when she was about to connect her laptop to the screen, she realized that there was no screen. So a little bit of panic, she went and asked the organizers, assuming that they would say, "Oh, sorry, Marie, now we are going to fix this for you." But what they did instead was they started laughing. They started laughing. And so she says, "Why are you laughing?" And they say, "Look, Marie, you want to show 50 slides, but actually, you've been invited to give a talk to the Association in Finland of Blind People."
Oh, no.
Blind people. Now, Fred, I know it's an extreme example. It sounds like a bad joke, but it happened for real. You see, Marie was very well prepared, apart from one thing. She didn't know her audience. She didn't even take the time to translate the name of the association from Finnish to French, and she would have realized that perhaps there was no need to have 50 beautiful slides. So, the reason why that happens is because often when we give a presentation, the very first thing most people do is either they just open up PowerPoint and put together some slides. It could be PowerPoint, it could be any other presentation tool. It doesn't make any difference. And that's not the very first thing you want to do. Or we also start thinking about our message, what we want to communicate. But that is also not the first thing we want to do. We need to start with the audience. And that's the second challenge that I see all the time.
Yeah. Now, I would love to say that you have just wasted your breath because this will not happen to salespeople because we're very good at understanding our ideal customer. And by the time that we are presenting, we've gone through various parts of the sales process. So our message is going to be finely tuned into something that's 100% relevant to them. I cannot say that though. No, I mean, even when, I mean, if we're talking about ourselves or giving presentations too early, I mean, that's that's one of the mistakes I have to help people deal with. But even further down the line, it's amazing after all that good work where you've got all the clues, all of that information about what they need to hear. like you say, it's right. We'll get the PowerPoint open. Ah, well, I've got all these slides, and I like this slide. That's a really pretty one. Oh, and I like that one too. I like. Oh, that shows this really well. Bang. All the stuff that you've worked so hard to get, and your presentation should be perfect, ruined. So I can't. So yeah, you've called out a challenge, which is very, very relevant to salespeople as well.
Yeah, because we often we often approach communication from our own perspective, whereas we always need to make it about them. We can talk about these in more detail if we have a chance later. Now, you asked me for three common challenges that I see. Another one is that, and it's connected to the fact that what most people do is the very first thing they do in preparation for a presentation is they just open up a presentation tool. And instead of that, now what we need to consider is that there is a structured way of thinking about presenting, which goes beyond just PowerPoint or again any other presentation tool. And here is the process. You want to start with the audience. Again, you want to analyze the audience. You want to brainstorm, and you need to do it in a structured way for you to identify your key messages. You want to be able to support your key messages with the right mix of logic, facts and figures, and emotion, storytelling, analogies, metaphors. You also want to be able to create a clear storyline from the very beginning, where you want to be able to grab the audience's attention to the very end with a powerful conclusion. So there are practical ways to do that. Then you have the illustration side of things. Now, we don't have to use PowerPoint, but if we do, I know that you see these in your space as well, Fred. I often see the typical death by PowerPoint with lots of text and bullet points. We know that people can't read and listen at the same time. So if we use a visual support, it should be a visual support, something visual, simple that reinforces and supports a message. And then you have the last piece, which is your ability to make a good connection with your audience. And that also comes with your delivery skills. So things like eye contact, body language, gestures. So it's your message, it's your visuals, it's your delivery. These are the three key skills that you want to master. And that's what I mean when I say that there is a structured way of thinking about presenting. And often not following that process is what creates discomfort when we are in front of an audience. It's also what makes many presentations unsuccessful.
Yeah, I know. I'm thinking of examples of stuff I've seen. Every single one of those little parts you've said, you can spot where somebody hasn't done that piece. Or even, and I see this way too often, it's you never did that originally. And now what you do is you keep presenting the same thing. So almost like the original sin was this, and you just keep amplifying it because you're doing the same thing wrong every time. And really we just go back to the beginning and recreate something that even if it becomes more of a standard presentation, which I would also argue against, but more standard, at least it's been built properly from the outset.
Yep.
Yeah, I see that. I see that a lot. Um, I'm just wondering whether I do it sometimes. Now, no. Keyword is now.
Yeah.
um, right. So, okay, three problems, three solutions. Have we got three broad ways in which, if we just did this off the back of this podcast, people go, I'm already doing something better?
So, okay, let's start with the first thing we want to do, which is connected to the second problem I mentioned, which is starting with the audience. Now, how do you do that in practice? Now, the very first thing we do, for example, Fred, when we work with our clients, is we always, and this could be either in preparation for an actual presentation or in general with those who want to simply improve their general presentation skills. We always start with this idea of the ABC. The ABC, we call it the ABC of preparation. And ABC stands for audience, burning needs, context. So say, for example, that you are preparing for a presentation that you need to give in a couple of weeks from now. The very first thing you want to do is ABC. You need to ask yourself some questions about the audience. Who are they? What are their roles? Which companies do they work for? So some questions about the audience, some questions about their burning needs. What do they really need? What do they expect from your presentation? What challenges do they have? How do those challenges relate to your activities, to your presentation, to your topic? What do they expect to hear? What do they need to hear? So these are some questions about their burning needs. And then also the context. You need to ask yourself some questions about the context. For example, is it one-to-one? Is it one-to-many? If it's one-to-many, how many? Is it in person? Is it online? If it's online, what tool are you going to use? Are you sure that that tool will work for your audience? So I'm not saying that if you don't do that, then you can't create a great presentation. As you said, you mentioned standard presentation. You may end up creating a fantastic standard presentation, but it may not work for your particular audience. So that's one thing you want to do to address the audience side of things. Start with the ABC. In terms of developing and communicating a simple message, there are two broad areas that you want to consider. One is the message itself. You have to simplify your message. And the idea is that if everything is important, then nothing is important. We often think that everything is important, but we need to put ourselves in the audience's shoes. If everything is important, then nothing is. And again, later, if you want, I can give you maybe some practical frameworks to do that. But we need to simplify the message itself. We also need to simplify the language that we use. Again, depending on the audience, but what great communicators do is they use language that a 15-year-old would understand. And so that covers the simplicity side of things. And then what was the third problem I mentioned? Oh yeah, the process. So rather than just opening up a presentation tool as the only thing you do in preparation for a presentation, you want to follow a certain process. You start with the audience, you identify your key messages, you translate your ideas from a brainstorming session into a clear and engaging storyline from the very beginning to the very end. If you think that it would help the audience if you were to use a presentation tool, then go ahead and do it, but keep it simple and visual, one idea per slide, just something that supports what you're saying, not something that replicates what you are saying. Again, people can't read and listen at the same time. And then from a delivery perspective, again, we can talk about lots of delivery techniques around eye contact, body language, posture, gestures. But the most important thing is you need to rehearse. I don't know whether you see the same thing in your space, Fred, but what I see is that many people, including business leaders, salespeople, sales directors, most people don't rehearse their presentations. They just think that it's okay to just go and improvise and wing it. What great presenters, great communicators do is they rehearse. And rehearse does not mean thinking about what to say. Rehearsing means repeating your presentation out loud from the very beginning to the very end without stopping, as if there is a real audience in front of you. So that's another thing that we need to consider, following a certain process, which goes beyond just opening up and creating some slides.
Yeah. Isn't the old adage that if it sounds rehearsed, you haven't rehearsed it enough?
So true, Fred. Let me share this. Now, many people tell me, you know what, Andrea, I don't want to rehearse because if I do, then I sound robotic and I want to appear natural and authentic and spontaneous. Now, Chris Anderson, the organizer, he used to be the founder, the organizer of the TED conference, like TED Talks. In his book, TED Talks, uses a great analogy. He says rehearsing is a bit like climbing a mountain. If you want to climb a mountain, let's say that you start climbing, you start going up, and then you stop, you will never get to the top. So, what do you need to do? You need to keep climbing so that you reach the top and then you can start going down. When it comes to presentations, it's the same thing. So again, Fred, say for example that you have a presentation in a week, in a couple of weeks from now, and say that you rehearse once, then of course, yes, you will appear robotic. But when you appear robotic and not spontaneous, it's not because you have rehearsed. Often it's because you haven't done enough. So we need to keep climbing. We need to keep rehearsing so that we get to the top of the mountain. And getting to the top of the mountain means that you have internalized your message. You don't have to memorize it unless memorizing works for you. But for most people, I would advise against memorizing a message, but you need to internalize it. You need to own your message. And so, as counterintuitive as this may seem, but the more you rehearse, the more spontaneous you will appear.
Yeah, I mean, I know I deliver a webinar pretty regular basis. Once a week, once every 4 weeks, 6 weeks. And yeah, I practiced it. I'm always tweaking it, but it is a tweak because I've internalized those bits. I know when this slide hits, this is what I say. The slides are pictures anyway, so I can say what I want. But if we go over them, the last four, you say the same thing every time, Fred, pretty much. Yeah, because that's the point I'm trying to make on that. That's the impact.
And
And
then,
that's why they're getting better.
yeah, that works because I assume, Fred, that in the example that you've just shared, anyway, the audience is different. It changes all the time, so it makes a lot of sense to say the same things. Or
Yep.
when we say to say the same things, now, if you are more of an improviser, I'm not talking about you, but in general, because I see two types of speakers. You've got the improvisers and the memorizers, and there is no right or wrong approach. There's only the approach that works for you, and it's a spectrum, by the way. So
Yeah.
first of all, it's useful to know, am I more of a memorizer or am I more of an improviser? Because there are some implications. But then it doesn't really matter whether you are a memorizer or an improviser. I would always encourage you to rehearse a number of times. And especially for improvisers, even if every time you rehearse, you say different things or you say the same things using different words, different sentences, that's okay. Again, it's not about memorizing, but I can promise you, whatever you say, the fifth time you say, for example, will be much more impactful than the first.
Yeah. And you come across ways of saying it that just seem to land better. Keep it. Don't do what I did for a little while, which is change stuff just because I got bored saying it. No, it's working for the audience. It's a different audience, or sometimes the same. What I found is that with these things in particular, some people come back because they want to hear stuff a couple of times, or they like hearing stuff.
True.
And so make sure we stay consistent with that. Um, oh no, this is really good stuff. This is really good. Um, okay, so we've got three problems, if you like, three things, two challenges that we tend to see, three solutions broadly for them. Really, really happy you've come along and spoken to us about this. Where can people get in touch with you?
Thank you. Thank you, Fred, for the opportunity. Very simple. So my main social media platform, if you want, is LinkedIn. So people can find me there. Feel free to connect and say hi. Our website is ideasonstage.com. And then maybe one thing for those who want to assess their current presentation skills very quickly for free. We have a scorecard and the Confident Presenter scorecard, and the URL is ideasonstage.com/score, like when you score a goal. And you can answer a few questions, you get a score. That score tells you where you are, where you need to improve, and it also identifies opportunities for improvement, and it's free to take.
Thank you for listening to the Sales Today podcast with me, your host, Fred Copestake. I hope you've enjoyed what you heard today. If you did, please get in touch and hit subscribe. And remember, you can take the collaborative selling scorecard for free to check out how your sales approach works in today's environment. You'll find it in the show notes.